year and a half, 2 years. I'm trying to remember when it was published. But
yeah,
it's been
about 2 years ago, January.
Now. Yeah. I would say headed in the right direction. It's not an A, it's above a C.
Okay.
And a lot of focus in the last 7-8 months from this secretary. Every week, every Monday, we spend 2 hours going through elements of the NDS and implementation of it, and with all the combatant commanders, all the joint chiefs, all the service secretaries. So it is not once in a while, it's every Monday. So to give you an idea of the degree of focus. How much progress? That's a tough one. I would say you could, I'm trying to think of how lenses you might look through fiscally, global force management, like how we're using our forces, structure-wise. I'll just take a couple of them if that's okay.
Yeah, please.
How we're using our forces around the world. Here it's really hard to grade because the world is not allowing us to do the NDS in a vacuum, let's just say. And by the world, I mean primarily the Middle East. I think the document was drafted with a vision of where things might go. The Middle East has not quieted down. So it continues to pull resources, attention, forces towards the Middle East that otherwise would be directed toward, one of the peer kind of competitor adversaries, whatever term people like to use. So the world is getting in the way sort of in one aspect. It's making it difficult to allocate the right forces. And it's also making it difficult to do the unpredictability because we're spending the resources we have towards the Middle East, which leaves less that you can use in the bank to go out unpredictable, if that makes sense, the kind of dynamic part of it. Fiscally, I think here I'd say progress also. How much? Designing the force, takes, of course, people in this room know it's not going to happen in a year. So I think some legitimate, if not frustration, concern by Congress, like we're looking at your budget for 21 and we don't see all this significant change. Fair criticism, or fair question, I think, to ask. I think the awareness off the charts, A+. Progress in terms of how we're using our forces, pulled in another direction by world events. And that's just going to happen. As far as reshaping the force, I know where we are, and then I'll just end up on the Marine Corps. On ours, I think in terms of the execution of the NDS, and I would combine with that, ma'am, I would combine the defense planning guidance, which is a classified document, but it anchors, it even puts a finer tune to the what direction should you go, should the department go. There it's more prescriptive, more narrow. And it's consistent. So I think for us, we know who our pacing threat is. We know what our primary theater is. That's what we're designing the force to meet.
Can I return for a minute to your points in the Middle East? It's something that we have been thinking about and talking about a lot here at CNAS. To what extent do events in the Middle East and the choices that we're making about how to manage those imperil the NDS? And I wonder if you could offer a few thoughts about that.
I don't know about imperil is a great word. I think that probably is a fair way to look at it. In another way, we're not talking in this context, but I think it could also delay. In other words, the plan still remains the plan, but we can't get there on the pace that we had intended to. So until, in other words, things in Iran change, until some things settle themselves out, and they are now, then it's, I would say, more like deferring. In terms of ends, ways, and means, you're deferring a portion of that. The ends haven't changed where you're headed.
Yeah. Using up your flexibility in terms of force employment. Is a delay. Is certainly a delay. I want to turn now to your planning guidance for the Marine Corps that you released very shortly after you became the Commandant, which was very bold. Folks in the chattering class have been talking about this for months now, so I don't want to belabor it. But a few things that you said in that document, that the MAGTF is not the solution to every problem. We kind of had a running joke when I was in the Pentagon, like the Aflac duck, but MAGTF. commitment to modernization over force size. Some MEFs are more important than others. Were really bold statements. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what pushed you to release that kind of guidance so early. What is the case for change that you were addressing?
The NDS is certainly a part of that, without a doubt. But for me, the conclusion that we would have to make a significant change or significant changes predates the NDS.
Mm-hmm.
I think when I was in California at 1st Marine Expeditionary Force, the tension was shifting, but glacially, it was hard to recognize that shift. Then when I got to Hawaii for 2 years, and just by one of those times in your career where you get to work alongside of like-minded is the wrong descriptor, but Shags O'Shaughnessy and Not So Swift and Harry Harris and the group of people that was out there at the time was thinking forward, and that kind of pushed my thinking towards where we need to go. And I think my predecessors, and I won't speak for them, would have liked to have done the same thing. Couldn't because of Iraq and Afghanistan, I would say. Anyway, so pretty much the time in the Pacific and the war games that we conducted in Newport, here in Washington, D.C., in Hawaii, kind of confirmed that unless on the paths that our peer competitors are on and we are on, if we don't change, it's going to be ugly and somewhere 6, 7, 8, 9 years out. Not now, but it would be in the future unless some fundamental changes happen.
Yeah. It's interesting that you note that you're kind of thinking on this evolved as part of that group out in Hawaii with your fellow component commanders, so very much rooted in a joint context.
Absolutely.
Can you talk a little bit more about how, how that imperative for jointness that we're seeing driven by the threat environment, particularly in the Western Pacific, how that's kind of shaped your thinking?
I would say through one angle, people will view joint as an artificial must-do just 'cause sort of approach. That holds true probably for lower-end threats, where it's okay to work alongside a partner, it's okay to do it in a joint, jam it through a joint lens, but could one service or two services get the job done? Perhaps. Against a peer threat, not happening. So one is just the obvious nature that if you don't, and you try to do service independent things that kind of how the outcome's going to happen. So it's an eventuality. Maybe not again today, but pretty close in the future. You don't have a choice, in other words, or the outcome's going to be bad.
Yeah. Talking points like any sensor, any shooter, right, sound really good, and I think we all kind of appreciate the need to move in that direction, but making it real when all those sensors and shooters belong to different services who are conditioned to operate pretty independently from one another is a real challenge.
It is. I don't remember how long ago was like the net-centric sort of, I don't remember how long ago it was, but there was a discussion at some point a couple decades ago about a net-centric approach to how we're going to operate, which was fantastic, sort of stitch everything together, one giant network, everything can talk to everything. Then, the realization that, again, a peer threat is, our opinion, is going to go after what they see as all our vulnerabilities, our weak spots, and that's going to be logistics, and that's going to be command and control. So they're going to try to sever all that network. So then this is the discussion out in Hawaii. You can't build this monster network over top of everything if it's not resilient. If it can be severed in 3 spots, can you still get target quality data to a shooting platform?
Right.
Or not?
Does it degrade elegantly?
Does it degrade elegantly? Yeah. Exactly. And then there's the human part, which we don't always talk about. We talk about the systems, the platforms, the kinetic part, but I'm going to oversimplify a bit, but the last 20 years, one of the downsides is that the leaders who came up through the counterinsurgency sort of mode and working in a forward operating base, if this was our operations center, there would be like 6, 7, 8 of these all going at the same time with different views of the whole battle space, and we just got we fell in love with situational awareness, like we couldn't do anything without it.
Yeah.
So I think, in other words, it's a double-edged sword. I think when we're operating in a really degraded kind of environment in terms of command and control and computers, I think the junior leaders are going to operate faster, and the senior leaders are going to be really nervous.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have to put in a plug for Chris Doherty's forthcoming report on Commandant information, because he's another senior fellow here, talks a lot about those issues, and in particular how even if you can get your comms networks resilient, if you have to, if you're in a Marine Corps chain and you have to go all the way up to the top of that chain and then all the way down into an Army chain to, put a munition on a target, you've lost. It takes too long. And
this is where we're going to have to make some changes. I agree. I don't know. I haven't read, of course, what he's written, but part of the reason we went all the way up and all the way down, frankly, was things like CNAS, collateral damage. In other words, somebody way up high had to make the call, could you hit that building because it was only 50 meters away from another or something or other. Well, that's not realistic in a dynamic fight at all. And that was really the only reason you were going up 3 levels to get your fire plan approved, was CNAS or collateral damage or whatever the level was set at. Some general officer had to approve the strike. That ain't realistic.
Yeah.
Not in a dynamic fight at all.
Yeah. Yeah. So
we have to change our behavior, in other words, and accept, frankly, there's going to be collateral damage. There's going to be civilian casualties.
Yeah. I think that, certainly we all have to have very healthy appreciation for the fact that a war with China would look very, very different than the kinds of conflicts we've been fighting in Iraq and
hopefully there won't be one, right?
Hopefully there won't be one.
Right, won't be one.
But to that point, I want to go back to the point that you made about how the wargaming had informed your thinking on this effort. We here at CNAS are also working on building out a more robust, unclassified wargaming program because we believe deeply in that tool's ability to expose people to problems and get them thinking about problems in a different way. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
I think in terms of modeling and simulation, we've made strides. We got a long way to go. In terms of thinking, and this is where the group at Hawaii was really fantastic, because we were all critical thinkers, didn't fall in love with drink the Kool-Aid too much. So in the war games, you'd be realistic. And if you take the National Defense Strategy and defense planning guidance and you look at a map, in one half of the globe, it leads you towards the conclusion this is sort of a maritime-centric approach. In another part of the world, not. But in that part of the world, in the Indo-Pacific, it calls for maritime and air solutions if you're going to deter, and then if it gets worse. So we had to figure out how that stand-in force and a standoff force, how's that going to work? Yeah,
absolutely. And what's your conclusion? You've been hearing kind of the mix is the secret sauce.
I don't know. I wish there was a secret sauce. Well, if there is a secret sauce, it's a secret. But I haven't found it yet. There is, I think, though, this is healthy discussion, not and as long as it's elevated academically to the point where it's structured. In other words, on one end of the spectrum is standoff is the way to deter a peer adversary. There is no need to have anything in close. This is going to be a future of just long-range precision weapons staring at each other with ubiquitous sensors, and that's how we're going to avoid war. That would be great, except for, we live in the real world, and so I don't think it's that alone is my point. I think that the what that misses is everything in here in terms of everything from partners and allies. In other words, the reassuring part of that we are astride you, we're along with you. Because if you pull back, you're just saying we're turning our back on you. And then there's also the physical part of if you're going to deter a country like China, who's very willing, their game plan is not to do it kinetically. Then if you're not in a space, they move in quickly. So it comes down to you have to have forward forces for 3 or 4 main key reasons, but you need both. You have to have both.
Yeah.
I believe.
And I think that dynamic force employment, which we talked about a little bit earlier, is a critical component.
Absolutely, yeah.
That operational unpredictability, as Secretary Mattis used to describe it. Yeah.
We have more to learn there.
Yeah.
But yeah, we have more to learn in how to be in deception, right? People used to be really, really good at that in the 70s and 80s,
Yep.
60s, 70s, and 80s. It's an art form, right?
Yeah.
There's a psychological aspect that we have to relearn,
Right.
I think. And part of the reason I'm linking the two together is part of the dynamic part is it's perception. You're trying to create a perception in an adversary's mind,
That
right?
you're there all the time.
Right.
Yeah.
It was something he was not expecting.
Yeah, absolutely. I do want to talk a little bit about naval integration, and I liked the way that you put it in the planning guidance, which was almost like ask not what the Navy can do for the Marine Corps, but ask what the Marine Corps can do for the Navy. I'm paraphrasing.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about more what informed your thinking about that, what changes in the threat environment are kind of forcing this greater integration and kind of also how's it going?
So I think first, it's not although some people characterize naval integration as some kind of emotional bond or something like that. It's not. This is very pragmatic, very practical for us.
Yep.
In other words, it's a must-do because if you accept the premise of the National Defense Strategy and the operating environment the way it describes it and the way it's shaping up to be, then you need a very strong maritime element. And in that regard, you need a combination of Navy and Marine Corps forces to do something. And so what is the something? Most of us are convinced what you don't want to do against a very large country, if you're into deterrence and if you have to respond to something, you don't want to match them up in mass, like symmetrically, force on force. That's not good. You're on their turf. They have short lines of communication. You have long ones. So you have to find where you have a asymmetric advantage. Ours, I think, we have a number of them in the U.S. in the military, but one of them is 70, 80 years of work on how to operate an amphibious force. How do you operate in an expeditionary naval manner, project power where you need to at will. Nobody else on the planet is close, although they're working hard to get there. So we need to take advantage of where we have a big margin, if that makes sense, and stretch that out.
Yeah. So you mentioned that this is a very pragmatic exercise, and I wonder if you could give us a few examples of kind of specifically, what's changing or what needs to change in this space.
The main center point here is the tactical to level, okay? Mm-hmm. So what Navy and Marine Corps forces at the tactical level work back up? What makes sense to work together as a team? So the Navy's previous CNO's approach in terms of distributed maritime operations anchors on the fleet. We got to be able to fight as a fleet. If you're in great power competition, we have to relearn how to fight a fleet. Mm-hmm. So that's where I began. Okay, if the fleet is the center point, that's how the maritime component is going to fight through. How do we support the fleet? How do we become part of sea control and sea denial? Mm-hmm. If that's their game plan, where do we fit in? Because we cannot be passengers anymore.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And I'm assuming you've got a very willing partner in Admiral Gilday. Mm. Yeah.
Very.
Yeah, good.
He's a lot smarter than me. We have the same barber pretty much too, but yeah.
It's convenient. So I also have some questions about how you're thinking about the impact of naval integration on force design.
Yeah.
And so I'll jump to the force design topic. Sure. I know that the plan is not out yet, hotly anticipated by all of us in the chattering class. Can you give us a little preview of what might be coming?
Yeah. If I could, ma'am, and I'll link both together. The Navy and Marine Corps, let me start on the Navy side real quickly, and then I'll shift. Two parallel efforts, in other words. On the one hand, a naval force structure assessment, integrated naval force structure assessment that the Navy and Marine Corps are doing. That's that's the requirements part on the Navy side. How many, what type of ships are we going to need now and into the future? We had already begun a force design of the Marine Corps. So they're not linked together in terms of timing. They are clearly informing each other, I would say. Because the Marine Corps that we have is going to relate to the ship mix that the Navy has. There is going to be some relationship, always has been. Our force design effort started last July. I think my predecessor again would have, he foresaw what needed to be done and started us leaning in the direction we're headed. So for the past 6-7 months, that's what we've been doing. And at the fundamental part, I think any organization, any corporate entity reaches a point where the kind of corporate leadership says, if we don't make some very fundamental changes, we're going to get left in the dust. We're not going to get left in the dust, but it's that time for the Marine Corps. We have to now make a fundamental change. So we redesigned the Marine Corps, and we picked a time frame far enough out where it's not in the turmoil of manpower and budgetary sort of churn, which is 5 years and in, just give or take. Because we have gone down that road before and tried to make pretty large changes, and it's difficult when you're inside that churn. So we picked 10 years out. We picked 2030. Probably could have picked 2035, but we picked 2030. Made assumptions about technology, made assumptions about the threat and where they're headed. And then we designed what the Marine Corps should look like in 2030. Then map backwards to today's force, which is sort of an inverse way of looking at it. And now we're in the stage, just to finish it up, now we're in the stage of, as coach to me, and I think great advice, this week and next week, meet with the 4 committee chairs and the ranking members of the 4 House and Senate committees that have jurisdiction or oversight over military. So have already met with about a third of them. I'll meet more today and tomorrow, one by one. This is where we are, because great coaching, I'm sure you got the same. Don't surprise them. They can help. Just inform them up front. Once we're done that next week, then we'll be off to the races.
Great. Yeah, I think that's absolutely the right approach. And I wonder, so this 2030 timeframe, you know, in order to get there by then, there are investments that need to start happening now.
There are.
You know, very much at the heartbeat of the churn in the fit-up. And so I wonder if we can talk a little bit about the 21 program. You know, what were the big bets? Where did you accept some risk? And you know, maybe perhaps it's premature to be thinking about 22, but I'm thinking about it already.
No, it's not premature.
You know, where are we headed? Where are we headed in the next cycle?
Because you know the budget cycle. The budget, this 21 budget, largely built in the fall, and we have to turn it into the services and then the joint chiefs up to the secretary. So this one you'll not see large changes. This one you'll see the beginning though. We have to contract the Marine Corps to some degree. We're not sure exactly how much. This year it's a couple thousand. And we're contracting in order to use those resources, because we don't own $13 billion ships, we own people. That's where our money is. So we have to get smaller to get better. So we're going to begin to contract back towards normal, where our sort of normal fighting weight is. We're large right now compared to where historically we've been. So this year you'll see initial investments in things like long-range precision fires. You'll see a beginning of a contraction of the Marine Corps. You'll see a few things in this budget that give you a window into the direction that we're headed. Next year, the year after that, much more fundamental changes. In terms of divesting, getting rid of some things that are legacy, and investing in things that we don't have right now.
And does it worry you at all that you're going to have to leave a lot of that work to your successor potentially if we're on that kind of time horizon?
Not at all.
Okay.
Not at all. Not a worry. If you're inclusive from the beginning with your senior leaders and they inform the direction you're going, it's the best view that we have. There is no question in my mind that whatever we envision for 2030 won't look like that in 2030. Not the least of which is because we have a pacing threat, and they're going to make changes along the way too, right?
Right.
So are we.
Right.
So we cannot, this is something every year, all the time, you're going to have to war game, iterate, make adjustments along the way.
Yeah.
Because the threat, the adversary is not static.
Yeah. It is a fine line, though, between kind of an adaptive plan that you can adjust as you go and a whipsaw.
Absolutely, yeah.
And one that sometimes different components in the department as a whole has struggled to walk.
That's primarily why we picked 10 years out, so we're not a whipsaw inside a 5-year window.
Yeah. I want to circle back to the question of training, which was another one of your key priorities from the planning guidance. And so we've talked kind of a little bit about concept development and force design. You know, how does all of this impact the way that the Marine Corps trains?
Yeah.
Both as a Marine Corps, but also as a maritime force with the Navy and as a joint force.
Most Marines by nature are pretty self-critical, except to outside audiences in which we brag all the time. But inside the family, we're pretty self-critical. I think in a couple ways, let me take first of all, first the pace. We are going at a pace in terms of deploying forces that's not allowing us time to get to the training level you would like. In other words, if you're the commander, in the last 10 years, it's a get on the bike and go, and there's not enough time to build a cohesive team and take your unit to the level you really want to go. So we need to buy them back time. Second, the means to train, the focus, the resources behind it, we haven't put our money where our mouth is. We did it intentionally because we were resourcing units that were deploying with the very best we could give them. But what we sacrificed along the way were things like training that we have to modernize. We have to give them the capability to do so. Last part of this, training, which we are wrestling with, don't have simple answers for. It's pretty clear right now it's hard to hide, even in training. So the challenge is, if you want to train your naval joint force out in the open, it's pretty much ubiquitous. Sensors are going to see how you're training. And if you want to conceal some of your techniques, conceal some of your methods, it's going to be really harder and harder and harder to do that.
Yeah.
Why do I bring that up? In other words, it wasn't long ago where you could take your whole joint force out to Alaska or China Lake or different places, no one would see you operating. Not the case going forward. So we're going to have our ratio of what we do out in the open versus what we do in modeling and simulation is going to have to change. We're going to have to do a lot more training out of plain sight.
There is a silver lining to that cloud, though. There's an opportunity.
There is an opportunity.
Set of circumstances you describe. We can leave it there.
There is.
I do want to come back to operational concepts. I think that each of the services has kind of been doing work. The Army with MDO, the Air Force making a big investment in JADC2, Joint All-Domain Command and Control, and and now obviously the Joint Staff leading an effort to develop a real joint warfighting concept. And I wonder if you can provide us any insight into what's happening there, and what is the Marine Corps, Navy Marine Corps team kind of doing in support of that effort?
This was another thing I saw pretty clearly in Hawaii, because you could already see the beginnings of that moving. Because minds like General O'Shaughnessy and Admiral Swift, they were going. They were moving, as well as each service. And although not in other words, not in a nefarious bad way, we're trying to break away from the herd sort of thing, just that we have a vision for how we're going to fight as a service and we're going. And now I agree with you. Now we're trying to stitch that together. Without, you can't reel it back in. You don't want to. So how do we stitch together the best parts of all of that into some joint construct? That's where we are. And we'll have that done this year, this calendar year. Now, I think that will morph, of course, over time, because the service doctrines, their concepts are moving. And there are great parts of each one that you don't want to lose along the way. Inside the Navy Marine Corps team, I would say distributed maritime operations, littoral operations in a contested environment, expeditionary advanced base operations. Those were concepts that are moving, resourced, because they provide a solution to how do you counter China, how do you deter China. So you don't want to arrest them and you don't want to retard them, but now you got to absolutely stitch them together into a joint construct. Have to.
And I wonder, I feel like it's been pretty well understood that concept development is sort of the birthright of the services, but the kind of increased imperative for jointness, I think may, and I want to know your opinion, kind of flip the script a little bit in terms of need for a little bit more top-down, vice, bottom up, and then just kludging them all together when you get to the top.
The way you just described it, that rugby scrum match, I think we're in the middle of that. I don't know if we know where we'll end up. I think that's a fair description of what we got to wrestle with. You clearly can't have the services running 100 miles an hour down their own paths and then down the road somewhere expect to stitch it all together in some kind of coherent warfighting manner. It's really tough to do that.
Well, but it's also really tough to say, in some cases, letting 1,000 flowers bloom is absolutely the right answer, right? It's insurance against a couple of those flowers failing.
It is. And of course, the dark side of that is you want an adversary guessing what.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, of course. Of
Right.
course.
You want them to work really hard to figure you out, not make it simple.
Not make it simple.
Not
exactly.
make it simple.
Well, I don't know. At least my experience at the Pentagon, we don't make anything simple. So it's good news.
Good news. We know how to, yeah.
We know how to complicate things.
We do.
We just need to complicate things for the adversary instead of ourselves.
True.
There's clearly an iterative process between concept development, force design, and then kind of training and doctrine, and back through the cycle to the beginning. And I think it's so tempting to develop kind of point solutions in any of those cases. Are you seeing a real move within the department to kind of let that iterative process play out, to remain flexible and not overly wedded to a single answer?
I think we're in a hybrid. I haven't thought much about it. We're probably in a hybrid place right now. Certain things, in other words, like hypersonics, artificial intelligence, maybe 2 or 3 or 4 others. Clearly, the department sees a future role in that, and it has to be harnessed and has to be more centrally directed and resourced. Other areas, less top-down, prescriptive, go in a fast iteration cycle, see what we can learn. So we seem to be in a hybrid place right now, and that may be really good.
Yeah.
Like to your point, the ones that are spinning fast, don't slow them down.
Yeah.
Let's see what we can learn. These other areas over here where we clearly need to maintain a margin of advantage, we can't let that just drift along on its own. They got to grab it by the reins and steer it.
Yeah. Another kind of key focus area of your planning guidance was institutional culture.
Yeah.
And I think you put out some additional guidance to that effect recently. Do you want to talk about any of those issues a little bit? How's it going? What are the challenges in making some of those shifts within the Marine Corps?
I would suppose any large organization has something, whatever you call the organization's ethos or culture, whatever it is, the macro, the big thing. But you can't have an organization bigger than 100,000 people that is not without subcultures in there somewhere. And there are a lot of them. We do too. And some of them are very good. In other words, some of the subcultures are young officers, staff NCOs who challenge the status quo, who have a better idea, willing to write about it and put the rig. You need that self-culture that says, I'm not buying that. There's a better way. Then there are the destructive self-cultures. We got to weed them out. We're at our soul a war-fighting organization, which at its soul depends on an implicit trust between you and me. In other words, not so much even that we know each other's name and we've been in the same fire. It's not that. It's just there's a Marine on my left and I trust that they have my back, sort of that kind of confidence. Anything that breaks that down is bad because your war-fighting ability goes down. Because you're going to hesitate or I'm going to hesitate if you follow me. Has to be absolute trust. So things like a Confederate flag that's a symbol to some of being divisive, anything that breaks down cohesiveness, we need to look hard at. And in terms of the, how do we look at other genders and do they fit into the service and all that sort of thing, we need to be way past that. Mm-hmm. And I think it's not complicated. Either if someone has that view that there's not a role for them, whoever them is, they either have to change their approach, their view, or leave, one or the other, because we can't have an antibody inside the team.
Mm-hmm.
Can't.
Yeah, and you see that very much as a core issue for warfighting effectiveness.
I do,
yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's not top-down driven, it's not because of something you read, it's because that breaks down the team. Mm-hmm. We don't trust each other, we got a real problem in a firefight. We got a real problem. Or close air support or any part of it.
Yeah.
You have to trust the other person in the team.
Absolutely. Okay, so we're going to open up for questions from the audience. I'll take the first one from the room here, and then we'll have a look, see if anybody's up on Twitter. Just here on the aisle first. For Mike, yes. Yeah, and let us know who you are and where you're from.
Michael Gordon, Wall Street Journal.
Sir.
General, you in the early part of this conversation, you mentioned that your efforts are being somewhat deferred or delayed by events in the Middle East, and that you're being pulled, in effect, by world events. But I was trying to think what the Marines were doing in that part of the world, and obviously there was a Marine artillery battalion in Syria, and there are Marine raiders in Iraq, as we saw this week. Maybe an F-18 squadron, a MU, but we're not at war with Iran. There's not a major conflict there. So that would really drain your resources in a serious way, like conflicts in the past. So my question is, if you were to be more selective about our interventions in the Middle East, in the current world context, what would you do? How would you go about that? And if you're promoting a strategy that doesn't take account of the continued turbulence in the Middle East and the need to resource that to some degree, do you have a realistic strategy?
First part, 2 parts to that, if I understand, and make sure I cover the second part as well. First part, I'm preaching to the choir a bit for folks in here, most of which who study military. If you pick like the Hornet F-18 squadron you mentioned, sir, of course, it's not one, it's the one that's there, the one that's training to go there, and the one that just got back. So we think always not 1, but 3. And our challenge, if you use that squadron, like that type of aircraft, we're in a transition from F-18s to F-35s. So the problem is we have to transition to a new platform that we're going to need for the future. At the same time, we're pumping F-18 squadrons to the Middle East. And it's not 1, it's more than 1, of course. The MU, the Marine Expeditionary Unit and the Amphibious Ready Group. That's a mobile capability. Not one you want parked in a certain region. If you're going to really be agile, if you really want to be unpredictable, but it's also a safety blanket, it's a reserve force, it's a very capable one you want to park somewhere if you think something might happen. So it stretches us in terms of becoming more operationally unpredictable, as long as there's a demand to park it off of here to try to prevent something from happening. We're trying to deter, in other words, a conflict with Iran. That requires forces to do that. And it takes away the agility that you would like to have globally to get there. The strategy part, is it a faulty strategy if it doesn't account for the turbulence, the uncertainty in the world? I don't think so. I think the ends remain viable. But I think it does alter the ways, certainly, means to a degree, I would say, if for a prolonged period you're not enabled to reach the strategy in the timeline you'd like to make it there. there's enough flexibility built into the strategy that's not on a rigid timeline. But I think the worst case is demands in the world can defer, can delay adjustments that need to be made for the future. And there, at the end, and I'll just finish up there, of course, we're back to the risk. In other words, what is the risk of having a different force or a lesser force parked here that might deter something from something that might happen 5, 6, 7 years from now? If it slows your transformation, if it slows your adjustment, which is the bigger risk to the force, to the nation? That's the calculus.
Thanks. Steve, do you have a question?
Yeah.
Right here.
Sir.
Thanks. Thanks for taking the time to talk to us today. It's been
Yeah.
very informative. I appreciate it. Warfighter suicide is something that's really plaguing all the forces, and I'm wondering what the Marine Corps is doing to identify Marines that are at risk of suicide, and how they're, once they identify those Marines, what steps they're taking to intervene.
Yeah. Our highest year, I think, was 2 years ago, less last year. It's on a lesser pace this year, but it's still it's a challenge that's not going to go away anytime soon. Last year, we began a trial of a different screening process for applicants who want to try to become Marines. It's a more comprehensive screening process than take the ASVAB, take a physical test, and you're qualified, ethically, as long as you don't have a police record. This is a much more deeper look into the cognitive, into the parts that might help paint a picture of, what's this person's likelihood of making it through this process. So on the front end, we have to do a better job of trying to understand the high school senior or junior, if that makes sense. Later on, for those that we see clearly have an elevated risk, like you're talking about, and we all know the factors: family relationship problems, money problems, legal problems, things that start to add up where that Marine, sailor, airman, soldier thinks that they don't have a way out, they can't get out of this box they're in. Then multiple things have to happen early on. First, our responsibility is to make sure that the whole stigma of I have a problem, we beat that stigma down, because it's hard, because we teach Marines you have to be tough, you have to not admit every time you get knocked down, get back up, get back in the fight, don't ever let your team down, don't admit weakness. And now we're telling them it's okay to be weak. But not really it's weak, it's just that you have some challenges and that's okay. So it's hard to create the environment where you have an individual that's really tough, that can handle a really hard fight, and if he has challenges or she has challenges, is okay with saying, the system is okay with them saying, I got like 4 or 5 things on my plate right now I'm struggling with. That's our obligation. And then we have to get in the professional help really quickly. Best thing that can happen, last thing, I think it doesn't matter the unit, doesn't matter the service. Best thing it can the best thing that can help is peers who recognize early on you're not acting right, and ask, like, what's going on. Not just watch it happen, but ask. Sort of the intervention part, like, you're not acting normal at all, and don't accept, well, I'm fine, and then you walk away from it. No, actually, you have to care. I mean, which we do, of course, but you got to get past the barrier.
Is there a system in place to identify the people at risk? I mean, is it systematic in the Corps?
It is. I don't know whether you call it systematic. We have levels of, I don't know how to put it in plain language, but there are increased levels where clearly the person is at risk, potentially. And we approach that in a different way at each level. Absolutely, yeah. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
I'm going to take one from Twitter now. Will asks, what is the Marine Corps' role in the future of EABO in light of the Philippines' potential decision to end military cooperation with the U.S.? So first, could you remind everyone what EABO is? And we can talk a little bit about the challenges with the Philippines.
EABO, the acronym is for Expeditionary Advanced Base Operations. It's a concept, it's a method. Say it's not a doctrine, it's a method, a technique that you might use if you're going into an area and you need to operate in a more distributed way and in a very expeditionary way. In other words, this isn't Iraq or Afghanistan where there's a coffee shop and you're flying in bottled water and all this other stuff. This is expeditionary, small unit, very dispersed, very distributed. That is independent of, well, let me tackle this challenge. Okay, if the president of the Philippines says, "Get out, America," and I'm over, get out all American military. I love you, but get your military out. What happens to EABO then? Well, the great part about a concept like Expeditionary Advanced Base Operations is it can be ashore, it can be on a ship. It may be that your expeditionary base is a ship. So the ability to move around in the first island chain, to move around in the northern Mediterranean, where countries allow you, you may choose to go ashore if you want to, or you can operate from ship. So do we need access to countries? Yeah, our military writ large needs access to countries. Absolutely do. Does the fact that a country says, if they say no, does that nullify, negate a concept? No, it should not, or else it's a pretty fragile method.
Right.
And it's not.
Good. It's good to hear. Sorry, back down the aisle. And if you could just let us know who you are and where you're from.
Hi, Matt Baynard, Defense
Yeah,
Daily. So first, with the release of the Force Design Review is close, likely weeks before the end of the month.
Weeks, yeah.
Weeks.
Yep.
And then in your preliminary talks with lawmakers, what have been their particular points of interest about how you're going to reach that 2030 vision? And within that, have there been any specific areas of resistance or pushback to kind of what you're describing to them? Thanks.
No resistance. In fact, support. Now, I haven't gone through all of them, so I have to answer that question definitively after 8, I suppose. But so far, just the opposite. So far, a recognition, or actually not an endorsement of the end state, but an endorsement like it's good that a service recognizes the need for fundamental change. How can we help you? Now, the rest of your question, no. What's the coaching been? The coaching bin is to understand the raw nerves, which you're smiling about. Things like reserve, anything to do with the guard and reserve can be a raw nerve. If it touches on industry, and it may mean a reduction in some program of record, how many of a thing you're going to buy could be a nerve. So the coaching is try to figure out where the potential friction points are going to be, figure out, first of all, when those changes might happen. This is where I think the 10-year horizon works favorably instead of a 2-year horizon. If we're going to adjust the number of something we're going to buy or field, that may be next year, it may be 7 years from now. So there's a bit of a cushioning effect that we're not going off a cliff here. So look, the coaching I got, which is really great coaching, look through the lens of a member, which means local constituents. What does it mean to my area, my workers, my people, my industry? Look through that lens, try to understand what the impacts are, and then go from there. It's been great coaching so far, really good coaching, and all supportive.
That's great to hear. I'm going to take another question from Twitter. We have another viewer who asks about recruiting. Are traditional images and symbols of being a Marine reducing the Corps' ability to conduct outreach and recruit the next generation of tech-savvy Marines? I guess, in other words, is the recruitment approach out of touch with the demographic you're targeting?
My answer is no. Yeah. I don't think yet, anyway, in the long as we can see. You don't join the Marine Corps to be a cyber specialist if you're a high school junior or high school senior. That's not why you're joining the Marine Corps. They're joining the Marine Corps because they want a challenge. They want to push themselves. They want to be part of something in their view looks more elite, more selective. They want to prove something. They want to be part of a very tight-knit team. The specialty is secondary, and that's the way every Marine recruiter approaches it. You're asking to join our Marine Corps. We're not hunting you because we would like you to work on computers or fly a jet or whatever it is. First, you're joining the Marine Corps to do a very tough, demanding job that's really rewarding. So I don't think today's advertising turns off. Well, I guess the tech savvy. I'm not sure how you would approach that. We continue to meet all of the recruiting goals for ourselves early on. I attribute that all to corporals and sergeants and staff sergeants who are in high schools. They know the students, and they look the part. They are the role model. They set the bar pretty high.
Yeah, it's great to hear.
The standards won't change, in other words. Standards are the standards.
I think we have time for one more. If there's one in the room, I'll take that. If not, we'll go back to Twitter. Okay. One last one here from Twitter. Sort of back again to developing CONOPS in the Pacific specifically. This is a very specific question, but we'll go with it. Will from Twitter, how would you envision employing HIMARS in Southeast Asia, and how can the Marine Corps work in conjunction with other services in this pursuit? And I'll just broaden the aperture on that question a little bit, because it sort of comes back to the issue of fires, the imperative to close thousands of kill chains in tens of hours, and how does the Marine Corps kind of plug into that idea?
HIMARS, the rocket system on a big tractor trailer sort of looking chassis, really effective for us for the last 15 years. And it's a common system largely between us and the Army, really effective weapon system. Also really big. On the other end of the spectrum is what one vendor has fabricated, which is a joint light tactical vehicle with a rocket pod basically on the back of it. Okay, now that's all the way from big rockets, long, heavy, big, deep range, to much smaller system, more mobile. We will need the ability, I need to give you the ability, if you're the unit commander, to move something, either use it from ship or use it ashore, that can kill land targets, that can kill maritime targets. As long as you have the sensor data that can reach out and touch it. And then you got to be able to move. Because if you shoot and then you don't move, you can be targeted. So where does HIMARS fit into that? HIMARS, where we want to put it ashore and can sustain it, is going to make sense. And it's also going to give us a chance to learn along the way. Because right now what we use for a certain land munition warhead on it may look different. We may be able to put a maritime missile in that same pod or something modified pretty close where it can do the same thing. So we're going to use it to learn from.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, please, everyone, join me in thanking General Berger for being so generous today with his time and his insights. Thank you very much for coming. He has a packed schedule, so I'm going to ask everyone to please keep their seats to give the Commandant a chance to depart. And many thanks as well to our audience, both here and on the live stream, for joining us. Thanks very much.